I'm a 51-year-old white, straight, cisgendered woman who was born in Canada. My family of origin speaks English. I do not have a disability. My family has always had enough money to meet our needs. I don't worry about not being hired because of my appearance or the color of my skin. I don't need to hide, change, or minimize parts of my identity to reduce the chances of mistreatment. I am a person of immense unearned privilege. Feminist scholar and anti-racism educator Peggy McIntosh describes white privilege as an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. As an educator, community leader, and advocate, I've come to understand that acknowledging the truth of my personal, invisible knapsack is fundamental to social change and to building the kind of world I want for my kids and my future grandchildren. Racism, ableism, homophobia, Islamophobia aren't sources of personal or professional hardship for me as they are for many others. That truth doesn't mean that my life has been easy or absent trauma. As you'll hear, my privilege hasn't insulated me from harassment or injustice. But undeniably, there are inherent advantages to being born with certain traits. Omar Ismail uses metaphor to talk about privilege. In a comedy bit I find compelling, he compares white people to tall people who can reach high shelves and as a result access more and better stuff. So specifically in this metaphor, tuna. He notes that this doesn't mean tall people don't deserve tuna or that they should feel guilty about getting it. Nor does it mean that short people can't get tuna or that there aren't disadvantages to being tall. But, he concludes, it does mean that white people have an advantage. He ends with the simple ask that people simply acknowledge that reality. Today, I'm going to share my personal story of surviving gender-based violence. In that telling, which may be triggering for some, I'm going to talk about how the experience almost broke me. My hope is that its recounting will inspire you to create working and learning environments free from harassment and discrimination. I'm also, however, going to share how my survival continues to inform my lens on privilege. So this story actually starts on December 6, 1989. I was at Western University, and my sense of self and security was shattered when a man who blamed feminists for ruining his life massacred 14 women at École Polytechnique in Montreal. 4 months later, an engineering student at Western named Linda Shaw was sexually assaulted and murdered at an en route on Highway 401. I knew Linda. I'd stopped at that very rest stop dozens of times. I was profoundly and personally impacted by those two atrocities for lots of reasons, but in part because they involved female university students I could relate to. Many, though not all of the women killed, carried an invisible backpack that looked a lot like mine. Even so, I never thought gender-based violence would happen to me, which in hindsight was irrational, because the evidence has long suggested otherwise. The number of women impacted by sexual violence is generally accepted to be 1 in 3. In 1997, I became one of the ones. Almost 25 years later, I'm mindful that I'm lucky to have survived an experience grounded in sexism, obsession, entitlement, and violence. Without question, my ultimate triumph over trauma is a poignant illustration of Ismail's metaphor. In my case, being the tall or the privileged person hasn't spared me adversity, but it has always, even in the midst of a nightmare, delivered advantage. Having considered 3 schools for my PhD studies, I chose Bowling Green State because I thought it was safe, physically and emotionally. I had 3 friends who were already there, and the city itself is quaint. One day, I noticed a tall, very pale-skinned man wearing army fatigue standing outside my classroom. Later that same day, I saw him at the gym, and then a few days later, he was outside my apartment when I opened the windows before bed. His appearance was very striking, and soon I saw him everywhere, in the parking lot, at the grocery store, always at the gym. He rarely spoke to me, but when he did, it was lewd. Mostly he just stared, glared, and smirked. I'd never met him, I didn't know his name, and I couldn't for the life of me explain his near constant presence. He was like a shadow. It was so remarkable and unsettling that after about a week I told my parents. Wisely, my mom, who worked in child protection, counseled me to keep a careful accounting of when and where I saw him. I made sweeping changes in my schedule. They had no effect on his behavior. He appeared out of nowhere, everywhere. Understandably, my parents grew increasingly concerned. My mom was adamant that I should cut and dye my hair in case its color was the root of his obsession. I refused, but I wore a baseball cap to see if that might have an impact. Nothing dissuaded him. He continued to stalk me, and I continued to document his criminal behavior. That process consumed me, but the log would ultimately provide the impetus for him to plead guilty to menacing by stalking, a crime for which he was sentenced to 2 years in jail. I was proud, but also saddened, to learn that it was the first criminal conviction under that statute in Ohio's history. The path to that outcome, all too rare in instances of sexual violence, was incredibly difficult. To secure the plea, I had to tell him repeatedly and to his face that the attention was unwanted. Nothing I had done before that or have done since was more frightening. For months, I lived in fear and had panic attacks. I'm still easily startled, and I get very anxious when my partner travels. As is typical, my academic performance, my physical health, and my mental well-being suffered. I spent a lot of time questioning what I'd done to elicit the inappropriate attention. I started doubting my personal choices. I felt particularly guilty that my entire family put their lives on hold so they could support me through protection orders, the university's judicial processes, and a criminal trial. My parents hired a lawyer at considerable expense to ensure my interests were looked after. My late father attended every single court date, many of which were deferred at the last minute after he'd already taken time off work and driven over 5 hours south from Toronto to Bowling Green. The entire experience left me feeling helpless and dependent. 20 years later, and after lots of therapy, here's what I want you to learn from my trauma. Inarguably, I survived being stalked by a man with a long, extremely violent criminal history because of my parents, my brothers, and a few close friends. Their education, their personal power, their employment status, their financial means, all of that fueled my ultimate triumph. So what about the young person who experiences harassment or discrimination and doesn't have access to what's in my invisible backpack? What about the amazing female, transgendered, Black, Indigenous, racialized students I support every day, all of them brimming with potential? Who will fuel their triumph? Here's why that matters so much. I was also a nationally ranked swimmer until I broke my back when I was 16. 2 years later, unable to do flip turns in a pool, I won the US 4-mile open water swimming title. I'm tough and I'm resilient. I started university the same year I broke my back and earned 4 degrees, most of them on scholarship. I'm smart. My first full-time job was in an all-male residence hall. I have a lot of experience with sexism, and I'm deft at difficult conversations. And yet, despite the combined firepower of personal competencies and unearned privilege, sexual violence almost broke me. In closing, I want to underscore your obligation as a leader to build, influence, and sustain healthy, just, caring, working, and learning communities. I take my responsibility to cultivate environments free from harassment and discrimination very seriously because I know firsthand what the consequences of inaction look and feel like. My ask is that you make that your mission too.